You're listening to Nothing's New on GNAT-TV, a historical podcast connecting the past to the present with Paige Vignola, Shawn Harrington, and Andrew McKeever. All right, well, welcome back to another edition of Nothing's New, the podcast where we look at the past to help us understand the present. Today is Friday, October 24th. I'm Andrew McKeever, and here with my two colleagues in podcast arms. Paige Vignola is the Assistant Director of the Manchester Community Library and one of the world's foremost authority on witchcraft.
Absolutely not true.
Well, that's what you told me yesterday.
That is also absolutely not true.
Oh, well, all right.
Locally.
Well, I thought it was a good way to introduce the show. Now we've got our listeners' attention a little bit, right?
Possibly.
The whole idea, anyway. But anyway, we are going to take a slight detour and talk about witchcraft because it's almost Halloween. Well, a week for less than a week till Halloween. And, witchcraft seems like a timely subject for us all to focus on. Also good to have Shawn Harrington, the curator of the Manchester Historical Society here. Shawn, good to have you back, and we'll be looking forward to some of your local examples of witchcraft, of which there are a couple.
Well, not so much witchcraft, yeah, I went down in Pownell, but, I was going to talk a little bit about our demon vampire.
So what's the difference between a demon vampire and a witch? Just for those of us who are... I would have
Paige?
thought kind of the same sort of thing,
What's the difference
right?
between a witch and a vampire?
I mean, isn't it kind of like the same dark black magic kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Vampires are supposed to be some form of demonic possession rather than, say, partnership with a demon, right? I'm also pulling that one out of my hat, too, because I've never actually really looked up what the definition of a vampire would be, because I think all different cultures have different folklore associated with it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, stick with us. We'll learn more because, Paige, I was wondering if you could maybe get us started here. I know this is a subject you've done some work in before and research on. And I guess just to kind of get the ball rolling here, when did witchcraft begin? I mean, what are the origins of the whole concept? I mean, was this something that we can trace back to basically the start of recorded history, or did this begin at some point after that?
I suppose it depends on how you define witchcraft. So I think fundamentally you can say that anytime there is humanity and humanity looking for answers, you're going to find magic, right? Or some kind of description of magic, because magic is how you explain things that you can't explain. Mythology is how you explain things that you can't explain. So you definitely have things like astrology, which would fall under the category of magic, right? Tarot reading, that kind of thing falls under the category of magic. You have, predictions, all that. So I think it would kind of important to take a look at the idea like the Aristotelian spheres, right? You've got like the terrestrial sphere and then you've got the celestial sphere, right? And people on Earth, you're talking about like an Earth-centric vision of the universe. People on Earth can look to the skies, and what's happening in the skies is going to be able to help you understand what is happening on Earth, right? Well, I mean, that's astrology, right? That's natural magic, or science. I guess you could look at define natural magic as science. And that's actually, for quite a while in history, considered something that is, quite good, right? I mean, it's very useful. If you can make predictions about the future, then you have the ability to aid your society. I mean, even in the 17th century, you have astrologers who were working in the courts in Central and Western European courts in order to be able to help the monarchs determine, well, what should I do, right? So
witches weren't always perceived as a negative kind of thing?
Well, that's not necessarily a witch, right? So, I mean, you've got the difference between like black magic and white magic, right? And so an astrologer would have been considered somebody who was dealing with white magic. It's natural magic. They were frequently referred to as the cunning folk, right? Black magic is a different sort of situation, which would have been the idea that maybe one was communing with a demon or with the devil, and it even more pulling up into the era of the witch hunts. It's the devil. People were seen to be talking to the tall man or the black man or whatever, the devil himself on Earth. And so oftentimes you have these cunning folk who were, prior to about 1500, the cunning folk who are actually being employed to battle the black magic that may be imposed upon them. Right. And so you have the ability to combat magic with magic. And that's not necessarily, again, like white magic isn't necessarily something that was seen as a negative. You do have kind of a shift from that, really, in the 1400s, moving into like the 1500s. And it's kind of interesting because you do have this concept of like the diabolical witch that really becomes far more popularized. And it's kind of becomes more in the forefront. That's not to say that every town in Europe had witch hunts. They certainly did not. That's not to say that towns that had witch hunts killed thousands of people or hundreds of people. Some maybe they found one witch. Some maybe they found 100. Right? It's obviously everywhere in Europe was different over the period of time, and so therefore different things were happening in each place.
So were European cultures the only cultures that had witchcraft, or did African or Asian or Persian cultures, were there comparable characters as well?
I can't speak to comparable, but I can tell you that absolutely witchcraft and magic exists in almost any kind of culture that I've ever heard reference to. I don't study Asia. I don't study Africa. I don't know Native American cultures. Like I just, so I can't really speak to that, but I can say that yes, certainly there are shamanistic ideas in just about every culture, and there is the idea of some kind of malevolent force in every culture. So sure.
Okay.
Yeah, think of Rasputin. With the Tsar Nicholas.
Absolutely.
Was considered, was certainly spooked a lot of people, and apparently wouldn't die.
No matter how hard they tried.
They tried.
Yeah. So anyway, I think it's kind of interesting when we're talking about the period of the witch hunts, right? We're really kind of talking about like mostly 1450s, say, to about 1700. I mean, give or take, right? In that period of time, there were probably there are wildly different estimates. In the 18th century, I think estimates were somewhere around like 9 million people. Right? I mean, but I think most modern scholars at this point in time would say that there were roughly about 100,000 people who were accused as witches. About 50% of them were deemed guilty of witchcraft and then therefore punished by death, not always with burning, sometimes with hanging. And about 80% of those accused and sentenced were women.
Which is interesting. I was just about to ask. It's how did witchcraft get associated with women and females as opposed to male witches?
So yeah, that's a delicate question to kind of tap around. How about we'll start with the idea that a witch typically, at least in modern English, is a word that is used to describe woman, right? Sorcerer was probably a more common term to somebody who would have been dealing with natural magic, right? Or an astrologer or something like that. One of the most well-known texts about witchcraft is 1487. I may be wrong on my dates, but it's a German text. It's the Malleus Maleficarum, right? I mean, that literally means the hammer of witches. So, if you have a sense of Latin grammar, then Maleficarum, very specifically with an A, not Maleficorum, which means that it is literally the witches are being defined as women. There's a whole lot of we'll say historical gossip about why perhaps Heinrich Kramer had written this text that really kind of tore into women. Literally midwives, I think, are mentioned no fewer than a dozen times in the course of his text. Just to give you a couple choice quotes, he says, midwives who surpass all others in wickedness. He says that nobody does more harm to the Catholic faith than midwives. He definitely does not like women who are practicing natural medicine, so to speak. There's again, if we want to go with the spill the tea, there's some suppositions one could say that part of the reason why Kramer wrote the text was because he was kind of run out of Innsbruck, so he kind of wrote it as revenge. He had apparently, we'll say persecute and prosecute in this sense may be interchangeable, but he had prosecuted so many women and put so many women in prison in Innsbruck that he was literally run out of the town. He was apparently referred to as being senile and crazy. And as he left, then he wrote his work, the famous work Malleus Maleficarum. Maybe it was a. I'm going to get back at you. Did he ever get married?
Did he have children?
Well, he was a Catholic clergyman, so whether he had children or not, I don't know. He probably didn't get married though. But he actually had, in the introduction to his book, he used a letter that had been written by Pope Innocent VIII. But the letter had actually been written before the book was written. So it's called Summus Desiderantantes Affectibus from 1484, and this was basically papal approval for the practice of seeking out witches, right? And he put that in as part of the preamble to his text, saying, "Look, see, I've got reason to be doing this."
So
does that answer your question about women? No. So go back to your other question about women, right? So women, when men were practicing magic, they were seen as kind of manipulating the nature, right? So this is a power play for them, right? Men were powerfully and practicing the manipulation of nature in order to be able to find answers. Women who were accused of witchcraft were frequently seen as being pawns of the devil. Right. And so therefore they were not strong enough in faith in order to be able to combat the devil. And so the devil was commonly believed, and again, we're coming into like the 16th century here, the devil was commonly believed to really want to involve himself of the workings of the human world. And he wanted help doing that. And so the devil would employ people in order to be able to do bad deeds for him on earth, in order to be able to turn more people to the devil. And that at that point in time, witchcraft really kind of became more of a secular crime rather than just heresy, right? It wasn't a religious crime at that point only. It was that then it becomes an issue for the law courts to pick up.
So to fast forward just a little bit, one of the, I guess, earliest and probably best known instances of witchcraft trials or situations were the Salem witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts.
Earliest in America, perhaps. Definitely not the earliest. Yeah.
The earliest here. So what was the story behind that? I mean, there were a bunch of women in Salem who were, for one reason or another, considered suspicious.
So first things first, let's talk about where you typically find witch hunts, right? Witch hunts are, and obviously not only because this is a religious belief that tends to lead towards this behavior, but you're frequently going to find witch hunts taking place in sort of border regions. So in Europe, you found where there's any kind of conflict between Catholics and Protestants, there are far more witch hunts that are taking place. When you have people who are suffering from, economic or food crises, then you're going to have somebody that you want to blame, right? And so oftentimes it's easy to find an outsider, find somebody who is marginalized, and that person is to blame. We often see many of the rituals that are often associated in modern minds with witchcraft it was being said that Jews were doing them in times of crises in England, for example, in the medieval period, right? And I was like, oh, they're going to be murdering babies and drinking blood, right? I mean, because you're trying to find somebody that you can other and blame stuff on, right? So when you take a look at what Salem looked like in 1692, I mean, think about it, this is a borderland, right? We're not even talking Salem town, we're talking Salem village, right? So those were technically, theoretically, the same entity politically, but Salem village was not on the water, and it was further removed. There was an ongoing frontier war with the Native American tribes, right? There were harsh economic conditions. There was a political strife between two major parties, we'll call them, clans maybe is another way of saying that, in the society, right? You had the Putnams versus the Porters, basically. Can also maybe blame some teenage boredom in there, right? I mean, these girls are a little bored, there's nothing better to do. They're not really allowed to do a whole heck of a lot. And there's definitely personal jealousies that are being manipulated for the purpose of perhaps solving long-standing arguments. So there's a lot of that going on at the time in Salem, right? So it's almost the perfect time and location in order to be able to have a witch hunt take place. There have been theories posited by scholars that it may have been like ergot poisoning, right? So that people had bad bread, and so therefore were kind of suffering from these hallucinations and delusions and whatnot. I mean, that's, I guess, possible. It seems a little bit of a stretch, but I'm not a biologist, and that's certainly not my area of study, so I'm not to say one way or the other. But the general situation in Salem in 1692, right? Basically, think about it. Between June and September of 1692, 19 people were brought to Gallows Hill, right? I mean, 19 people in a very short period of time. This all kind of started earlier, sort of like in the dead of winter, which is why I kind of made a joke about teenage boredom. But you have two families that are sort of at odds with each other, two very prominent families at odds with each other. It's the Putnams and the Porters. They're neighbors. They had a land dispute at a certain period of time. The Putnams were a very powerful family, and they had pulled in a new reverend. His name was Samuel Parris. He was a very orthodox, conservative individual. Was not willing to see any kind of loosening up of religious laws. It happened to be that his daughter was the first one to suffer these spasms that were later blamed on witchcraft. There is a story, again, how accurate it is, I don't know, that she was caught with her cousin, Abigail Williams, practicing witchcraft. I think they were like dropping eggs into water and looking at the reflections or something along those lines, in order to be able to determine who their future husbands would be. And when her dad walked in, she just seized up and apparently went catatonic. I mean, that sounds to me like a kid caught in a bad situation and you go, oh no, and you just sort of freeze. But it escalated from there, obviously. Abigail Williams was actually famously the character in Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible. She was kind of like the super bad girl, right? Anyway, so this escalates, and the girls, more and more girls fall victim to this, I've been touched by a witch. I've been harmed by a witch. Witches made me do this. Witches are pinching me. I mean, all of this type of stuff. And then they were told, basically, that if they said who the witches were, then, all is forgiven. So they started calling out people who were witches. The first one to be called out, no surprise, again, remember what I said, the people who were typically accused of witchcraft, right? Tituba. She was an enslaved woman who was Native American, Taino, I believe Arawak in particular, and she was enslaved by Reverend Parris when he lived in Barbados, and he brought her from Barbados up to Massachusetts. She may have been the one who was like teaching the girls how to do these, like, oh, you want to know who your husband is? Well, let's, he loves me not. I mean, the same kind of situation as that. And then Sarah Good was accused. She was a beggar woman, so she's kind of an outsider as well. Sarah Osborne was accused, and she was, horribly guilty individual. Apparently hadn't gone to church in a year, so clearly she must be guilty of something. And it's interesting that the judges who were called in for the case, they automatically made assumptions of guilt. Right. I mean, like John Hawthorne very specifically said, Sarah Good, what evil spirit do you have familiarity with? Not, are you a witch? Not any, I mean, like just sort of naturally assuming that.
No presumption of innocence there, huh?
No, absolutely no presumption of innocence. And actually, interestingly, so there was a gentleman called Cotton Mather who was a very prominent minister, a Puritan minister. And he made arguments for this idea of spectral evidence, right? You don't have to have real evidence. Spectral evidence is good in cases of witchcraft, right? I mean, just kind of take this for a moment at face value, right? You're a Puritan, you know the devil is real. And you know that the devil is trying to influence life, right? You know that the devil is trying to do his bad deeds for people on earth, right? And you know all of that is fact. Well, I mean, you're not going to be able to see him. So spectral evidence is a necessity in order to be able to, determine what is happening and what isn't happening. So Cotton Mather made this argument for spectral evidence. So when you have the court trials of these women in Salem, it's, you can't see it, but she's pinching me. Or, she walked by my farm and the cow died, right? I mean, and this is all evidence for how these individuals are clearly witches. And in the back of my head right now, Monty Python is just kind of circling around because each one of them must have weighed the same as a duck. But
Well, from there, why don't we hop over to something more local, Shawn? The vampire story. You were...
That was a quick 180.
Yeah, that was a definite spin. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to kind of make sure we could loop that in because you were involved in getting that sign put up just a little bit down the street there from the library.
Yeah.
And so tell us about what the vampire story that involved someone in Manchester. What in the 1790s, early 1800s?
Yeah, I think Paige has laid a great a great background of, what happened in Europe and how basically the superstitions and the beliefs, transferred to, the colonies. And, when the people came here, it was passed down through the generations, the stories and, folklore. And one of the interesting things, the reason why we have the story of the demon vampire in Manchester, because I'm involved with Vermont Folklife, which is up in Burlington, Vermont, and Andy Colavos, who was working with the William G. Pomeroy Foundation, to put up signs. They have a Legends and Lore program, which is really fascinating. And he called and said, "Hey, do you have any interesting stories down in the Manchester area?" And so we have something called the Pettibone manuscript in our collection. It was written by John S. Pettibone, who was born in 1786. He died in 1872. And in 1860, he sat down and he wrote a long manuscript, about the history of Manchester. All, talking about the town fathers, the revolution. He talked about, the growth of agriculture and merino sheep. And kind of there's like one paragraph, maybe two paragraphs, and I'll just read it verbatim that was written here, which was completely out of context of the rest of the script, but for whatever. And John was a very renowned, he was a lawyer, he was a representative, he wasn't a quack, let's say. So in the middle of all this, writing down some, so the history, and he wrote, "She used to be, in the words of one who was well acquainted with her, a fine, healthy girl. Not so long after they were married, she went into a decline after a year or so and died of consumption," which was tuberculosis. Captain Burton, after a year or more, married Huldah Powell, daughter of Esquire Powell and his wife. Huldah was a very healthy, good-looking girl, not as handsome as his first wife. She became ill soon after they were married. When she was in the last stages of consumption, a strange infatuation took possession of the minds and connections of friends of the family. They were induced to believe that if the vitals of the first wife could be consumed by being burned in a charcoal fire, it would effect a cure for the sick second wife. Such was the strange delusion that they disinterred the first wife, who had been buried about 3 years. They took out her liver, heart, lungs, what remained of them, and burned them to ashes in the blacksmith forge of Jacob Mead, which was actually right near the library.
Oh, that's exciting.
Timothy Mead officiated at the altar in the sacrifice to the demon vampire, who it is believed was still sucking the blood of the then living wife of Captain Burton. It was the month of February and a good slaying. Such was the excitement that
Did you say
from
a good slaying?
Good slaying.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah,
Good.
well, just in case you need to know that.
Good and bad.
Such was the excitement that from 500 to 1,000 people were present. This account was furnished to me by an eyewitness of the transaction. So, as I mentioned when we were sitting here before we started recording, it's hearsay. He was a lawyer and a judge too, but he found this to be interesting enough to write in 1860 to recount the story by somebody who apparently was there. So, and what you have to remember, those superstitions had come over, they didn't just like come over to the New World like, we have all new ideas. Well, they did have some new ideas, but they brought a lot of their old ideas with them as well. So in the late 19th century, a lot of these smaller rural communities, Salem, now we think Salem's like in the middle of Cape Ann above Boston. It is a very, it's a very urban area. Well, not so much back in the 1690s, as was, Manchester in 1791 when this all took place, 1790, 1791. We were still frontier, so in the late 19th century, you figure, people they still had their superstitions of, why did the crops fail? Well, it was still the kind of the mini ice. Well, that, they didn't understand it. And tuberculosis as a bacteria, they didn't know what tuberculosis was. And so, in the most recent, I guess, the last known documented case of vampirism, because that was what it was considered as a mythology, that the dead is rising to suck the living from the living. That really didn't make a lot of sense, or did it? Yes, it did.
No, I followed you.
Suck the life from the living. Suck the life from the living. That's the words I was looking for. So in Exeter, Rhode Island, there's a story of which is a great example of the New England vampire panic, when Mercy Brown, she died in 1892, and she was just 19 years old, and several other members of the family became ill. And so the neighbors convinced her father that one of the deceased might be draining the blood from the living. So draining the life from the living. So Mercy's body was exhumed, and because it was apparently unusually well preserved and there was still blood in the heart, she was declared a vampire. And her
Was
heart
it the
and
middle
liver
of winter by any chance?
was that? Well, there's a I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but there's a whole thing about it depends on what time of year they were buried, depending on what they died from, and the conditions in which they're buried. They can be remarkably well preserved, and some people just will rot away to nothing rather quickly. So, which fed into the whole idea. And the same thing that was brought over from Europe. I mean, this was not an American idea, so to speak. So they saw how well preserved she was, and there was actually still blood in her heart. So they removed that in her liver. They burned it. The ashes mixed into a tonic given to her sick brother in a futile attempt to cure him. So it didn't work. Nor did the Deacon Burton's wife was not saved either. So that was in 1892. So this is 100 years after what we look at. So and I'm the curator for the historical side. Generally speaking, the ghost stories and the folklore. I mean, it exists for a reason. But this was something that we had documented, albeit hearsay, that was written in 1860, and it was interesting to go out and I initially come across it doing. Cruising the internet, and the person who wrote the original article said they went to Dellwood Cemetery looking for her grave or whatever, and I said, well, interesting. 1791, Dellwood wasn't there. The old burying grounds were in there. I said, but Factory Point was there, so I went to Factory Point Cemetery and walked around up at the old section, and right up near the point, sure enough, I found her stone, which her stone alone is actually a beautiful work of art. It was carved by Zerubbabel Collins, who was from a famous carving family of marble carvers, and I think there was like 40 of his stones down at the old First Church lot down in Bennington. But just this remarkable piece of artwork that is actually her grave. And so when Andy called saying, hey, do you have any good stories? I said, as a matter of fact, yes, I do. Which led into, Jamie, because that led to, were the other stories along these lines, which, right. I think you have a little piece. And I went down for the dedication of the folklore down in Pownell.
Right. Well, yeah. So the other local witchcraft story we have took place in North Pownell, which had special meaning for me, having formerly lived in Pownell back a long time ago. Not in North Pownell, but just a little bit down the road from there. And I could easily picture the bridge over the Hoosic River where the widow Krieger, as she was known, her first name actually Margaret, was thrown into the Hoosic River as a test to see whether or not she was a witch or not, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, a bit of background. She and her husband had opened up a grist mill along the river in 1760, I believe, and it was very prosperous, and things went well. He passed away in 1785, and right after that, I guess in part because of the fact that the grist mill was doing well, and she was sort of independent and could kind of make it on her own. That aroused the suspicion of some of her, her nearby neighbors. And so they decided that she needed to be put to the test. And there were two alternatives. One, you could be put up on a tree and have the tree cut down. And if you died, that meant you weren't a witch. If you lived, that meant you were. And then I guess you'd be put to death. So sounds like kind of a bit of a no-win situation. Same with the option that the widow Krieger chose, which was to be dumped into the river. And if you drowned, then that meant we were wrong, I guess, and you actually weren't a witch. If you survived somehow or another, then presumably something else was going to happen to you. But anyway, so she was dumped into the river and began to drown, was probably flailing away, and clearly was not floating on the river. And of course, this is the middle of the winter as well, so it's an icy, cold river. Anyway, apparently one of the neighbors jumped in and rescued her out of the river. They realized, we made a mistake, and she was pulled out.
Just out of curiosity, Andrew, did she own her own property?
That I'm not sure of, because I would assume it would have passed under her ownership after he passed away. But
so this is a question that I have, because in Salem, for example, we know that there's a story of like 19 people put to death. One of them was a man named Giles Corey, who was not hanged. He was pressed to death.
More weight.
Right. Yeah, exactly. More weight. Exactly. And he was pressed to death because he refused to stand trial. right? I mean, so the idea was that, like, so first of all, if you confessed, then you wouldn't necessarily, be killed. And if you didn't confess, well, then obviously, we need to save your soul and kill you, right? So Giles Corey refused to stand trial. He thought it was a total sham, and he's like, "This is ridiculous." And so the reason why he didn't want to stand trial was because that if he did stand trial, then his property would revert to the state, right? So I mean, I just think it's kind of interesting because a lot of the suspicions kind of going around in Salem, there were some property disputes that were settled quite handily and neatly by having people removed. I'm just wondering if she owns.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there was probably a property or certainly a money question involved in this as well. I mean, she did also have. They had three sons. One of whom died in the Battle of Bennington, interestingly enough. But the other two would have been around to inherit the grist mill and the farm. But apparently, the fact that the farm was, was doing well and the mill was doing well meant that, maybe there was something there for the taking. And perhaps this idea of having her accused of being a witch was a convenient way to, as you say, maybe split up the property. But
the first woman in Salem put on trial for witchcraft was Bridget Bishop, and she owned a tavern. She did a really good business, sold ale, possibly even on the Sabbath. How dare she? So she was the first one. Again, easy to pick them out, right? Like, this is somebody we need to get rid of in society. This is an outsider. This is an outlier. This is not somebody who is fitting the mold. It sounds like it was something very similar there.
Well, anyway, there's now a historic marker down there by the bridge as well, I gather. And,
you got a job to do, Shawn.
There was that? No, there is one.
Oh, there is.
Yeah, no, there is one. There was a big dedication. You could go online and look up Krieger or Pownell Witch or any combination and see it. It was actually it was quite a day. I mean, they had a parade of witches across that bridge, and it was a lot of fun, and it was a great turnout. And she has a stone too. She moved to nearby Williamstown where she died, and actually you can go visit her grave. Just like our Rachel Burton, I suppose. So
right. I guess she was from Williamstown originally.
Right.
I should have mentioned. So, so I find myself wondering after all of this, when did sort of the belief in witches and witchcraft sort of die out, if it has? I guess it really hasn't died out. I mean, it's still kind of with us. We hear the term witch hunt a lot. Did that?
I see what
sort
you
of
did
finally fade away over the 19th century, as the scientific revolution began to kind of explain things a little bit more rationally than perhaps, it's the devil's handiwork here, using these agents known as witches.
So I mean that's a long question you just asked
right?
there. I mean, it depends on where you are. Voodoo, black magic. Are there places that still practice that? Shamanism, is that all still? I mean, is it gone from the Western world? I don't, for the most part, I think. But there's plenty of places in the United States you could go to, and you still be able to find that tarot reading, all of that stuff that's connected.
I think that's also a fair point as well, because I mean that's again difference between perhaps black magic and white magic, right? I mean, as I said, you've got like the cunning folk. You have people who will self-identify as witches today, right? I mean, people who are interested in herbalism and natural magic and all the rest of that. So did it go away?
Have we murdered anybody lately, or have we burned anybody at the stake? Not that I know of.
Specifically for witchcraft?
Specifically for witchcraft. Well, I think that was a a question you were getting, as far as the witch hunts go. But has it happened in other cultures?
Of course.
That I would believe so. I don't think it's happened in the States. Not that we're, it's just.
No, but I do
belief
think
of that, I don't think it's gone. I mean, is it muted? I mean, maybe, but it depends on where how deep you want to dig.
But let's talk about just like etymology of the term, right? Because you use the term witch hunt. Of course, people use the term witch hunt these days, right? Like, and it is a term that I think is bandied about quite a bit. But what I think is interesting about it is the way that it's used, right? I mean, it's not witch hunt in the sense of I'm looking for witches. It is witch hunt in the sense of I'm saying that somebody is knowingly and falsely accusing me of something, or knowingly or falsely accusing somebody of something, which I think is really interesting because it does show a cultural understanding of these witch hunts that took place in, the early modern Europe or in early America. Like, that those were absolutely ridiculous. And we can now acknowledge that that was an absolutely ridiculous thing to do. So, I mean, just in terms of the change in the way that the term is used, I think is very interesting.
I guess maybe nowadays we call it conspiracy theories or something like that.
Superstition, paranoid, neurotic.
Right. Well, anyway, so like I said at the top, it's almost Halloween. Witches are associated with Halloween. Is anyone going to be a witch for Halloween? Going out trick-or-treating around town?
We have about 1,400 pieces of candy at our house ready for the hordes that are coming. I'm sure I'll see a witch or two.
Yeah, same.
Probably devil.
Same,
Okay.
yeah.
Witch, warlock, shamans,
Sorcerers,
sorcerers,
Wizards.
All right.
astrologers.
Iron Man.
Well, so it sounds like they haven't completely gone away yet. Maybe they're still lurking around out there someplace. Maybe up by the Factory Point Cemetery, perhaps.
Cue creepy music.
Yeah. All right.
Or Metallica, Am I Evil?
There we go. Yeah, there we go. Bring it full circle.
So one thing we didn't talk about, which I keep on thinking, one of these podcasts we need to maybe do a deep dive on, is the whole sources issue. You know, where does this information come from? I mean, you referenced that a bit, Shawn. You know, what I should have included when I was talking about the Widow Krieger was that the first account of it was written in 1867 by a resident of Pownell, and that's basically what we have to go on that. But it's always interesting how we kind of have this tension between hearsay, first-hand sources, second-hand sources.
So I'm going to go back, Andrew, to a conversation we had probably a week or so ago, that just because it's a primary source doesn't mean it's accurate. Right? I mean, again, if you take the difference between, say, the petition of Mary Easty, who was one of the women accused of witchcraft, or the petition of John Proctor, one of the men who was accused of witchcraft in Salem, and compare that to the, say, I don't know, the jury notes or the judge's notes, or, John Hawthorne's notes. I mean, those are both primary sources, but each one has a different reason for writing them. So just because something is primary doesn't necessarily mean it is the end-all be-all of evidence. It's just those are sources that you can go back to in order to be able to get a better sense of, I think the source is going to give you a sense of the time, not necessarily the fact of the time.
Or what this person was thinking at the time.
Thank you. That's a much better way of
Which
saying
could
that.
be, grounded in reality or not.
Or maybe not. Right, exactly. Oh, well, all right. Well, shall we leave it there for today then? And plan to come back at some point, figure out more
Who knows what we're
linkages
talking
between
about.
past and present? Once we
There'll
know
be something where history repeats itself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's no shortage of those.
No shortage.
I'm sure we'll find something. All right,
Nothing's
folks. Well, thanks for being with us. This has been Nothing's New, a podcast on GNAT-TV with Paige Vignola of the Manchester Community Library, Shawn Harrington, the curator of the Manchester Historical Society, and me, Andrew McKeever. I'm just sort of floating around here and there. Good place to be.
Witch!
Warlock! No, I didn't mean it that way.
Thanks,
Anyway.
Andrew.
Okay. Take care, folks. Have a good Halloween.